June 26, 1948. The report arrived on Joseph Stalin's desk at 11:43 p.m., delivered by a nervous courier from the Ministry of State Security. The Soviet dictator was still working, as he often did late into the night, reviewing production figures from the Urals, reading intelligence summaries from around the world, signing death warrants with the same casual efficiency he signed agricultural directives. He opened the folder without looking up, his eyes scanning the first page. Then he stopped, read it again. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of emotion from a man who had trained himself over decades to reveal nothing. The report was from Soviet military intelligence in Berlin. American and British transport aircraft have begun flying supplies into Tempelhof and Gatow airfields in the western sectors. Initial assessment indicates 80 to 100 flights per day. Cargo includes food, coal, and medical supplies. Operation appears coordinated and systematic. Stalin set down the report and lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the dim light of his office. He sat in silence for several minutes, the smoke curling around his head, his mind working through the implications. He had expected the Americans to protest the blockade. He had expected diplomatic complaints, angry speeches at the United Nations, perhaps some symbolic gesture. What he had not expected was this: an airlift. A systematic attempt to supply an entire city by air. It was audacious. It was expensive. It was, Stalin had to admit, clever. He pressed the button on his desk, summoning his aides. Within minutes, the office was filled with the men who ran the Soviet Empire. Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister, Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the secret police, Georgy Malenkov, a rising party official, and Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, the Soviet military commander in Germany. Stalin tossed the report across the desk. "Read this." They passed it around, their faces showing varying degrees of surprise and concern. Beria finished first, his cold eyes meeting Stalin's. "They're trying to supply Berlin by air," Beria said. "It's a propaganda stunt. They can't possibly sustain it." "Can't they?" Stalin asked quietly. "How many transport aircraft do the Americans have?" Sokolovsky consulted his notes. "In Europe, approximately 200 C-47s and C-54s. The British have another 100 or so aircraft. Combined, they could theoretically fly several hundred sorties per day." "And how much does Berlin need?" "Minimum 4,000 tons per day to sustain the population. Food, coal for heating and electricity, medical supplies, everything. That's the absolute minimum." Stalin did the calculation in his head. So they would need to fly in roughly 40 tons per aircraft, multiple times per day, every day, indefinitely. In all weather, without accidents, without mechanical failures, without interruption. "Exactly, Comrade Stalin," Malenkov said. "It's impossible. They're making a gesture, trying to look strong, but they'll give up within weeks, maybe a month. Then they'll have to negotiate with us on our terms." Stalin stood and walked to the large map of Europe that dominated one wall of his office. His finger traced the air corridors into Berlin, the narrow pathways through Soviet-controlled airspace that the Western powers were permitted to use under the post-war agreements. "What if they don't give up?" he asked. The room fell silent. No one wanted to contradict Stalin, but no one wanted to answer the question either. Finally, Molotov spoke. "Comrade Stalin, even if they could sustain an airlift for a few weeks, the cost would be enormous. Millions of dollars, thousands of flight hours, the wear on their aircraft. The Americans are practical people. They'll calculate the cost and decide that Berlin isn't worth it." Stalin turned from the map. "You're assuming the Americans think like us, that they make decisions based purely on rational calculation of costs and benefits. But what if they don't? What if they make decisions based on principle, on prestige, on the need to look strong in front of their allies?" He walked back to his desk and sat down. Truman is not Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a politician, a pragmatist. He would negotiate, would look for compromise. But Truman... He paused, remembering his encounters with the American president at Potsdam. Truman is stubborn, rigid. He sees things in black and white, and he has something to prove. He's in Roosevelt's shadow, and he needs to show that he's strong. Beria leaned forward. Then we shoot down their planes. A few accidents, some unfortunate incidents in bad weather. They'll get the message. And start a war. Stalin's voice was sharp. Is that what you're suggesting, that we shoot down American aircraft in international air corridors and risk a conflict with a nation that has atomic bombs? Beria sat back, chastened. Stalin rarely raised his voice, but when he did, people paid attention. No, Stalin continued, his voice calm again. We're not going to shoot down their planes, not unless they violate our airspace, not unless they give us clear justification, because if we shoot them down without cause, we become the aggressors. And right now, in the eyes of the world, we're the ones enforcing our legitimate rights in our zone of occupation. Sokolovsky spoke up. Comrade Stalin, we could make things difficult for them without shooting them down, harass their aircraft, fly close to them, interfere with their navigation, make it dangerous and difficult. How dangerous? Stalin asked. Dangerous enough to force them to stop, but not dangerous enough to provoke them to war? Where exactly is that line, Marshal? Sokolovsky had no answer. Stalin stood again and walked to the window, looking out over the Kremlin walls toward the sleeping city beyond. Gentlemen, let me explain something to you. I did not blockade Berlin on a whim. I blockaded it because the Western powers are trying to create a separate West German state aligned with them. They're rebuilding German industry, introducing a new currency, preparing to integrate West Germany into their economic and military systems. This is a direct threat to our security. He turned back to face them. The blockade was meant to force them to negotiate, to make them understand that they cannot make decisions about Germany without us. But now they've responded with this airlift, and that changes the situation. How so? Malenkov asked. Because now it's a test of wills. If we back down, if we lift the blockade while they're flying in supplies, we look weak. We lose credibility. Every country in our sphere will see that the Americans can force us to retreat. But if they back down, if they abandon the airlift and leave Berlin, they lose credibility. Their allies will see that American promises are worthless. He sat back down at his desk. So now we're locked in. They can't quit without losing face. We can't quit without losing face. And the whole world is watching to see who blinks first. Molotov cleared his throat. Comrade Stalin, what if the airlift actually works? What if they can supply Berlin by air for months? Then we've made a mistake, Stalin said bluntly. We've given the Americans an opportunity to demonstrate their resolve and their capabilities. We've united the Western powers around a common cause, and we've turned the people of Berlin, who were our enemies 3 years ago, into sympathetic victims. The room was silent. It was rare for Stalin to admit the possibility of error, even hypothetically. But, Stalin continued, I don't think the airlift will work. Not for long. Winter is coming. The weather in Berlin is terrible from November to March. Fog, snow, ice. Flying will become much more difficult. Aircraft will crash, pilots will die, and the American people will start asking whether Berlin is worth the cost. He looked at each man in turn. Our strategy is simple. We wait. We maintain the blockade. We don't escalate, but we don't back down. We let the Americans exhaust themselves, trying to supply Berlin by air. And when winter comes, when the operation becomes too difficult and too expensive, they'll negotiate, and we'll win. Beria spoke up again. And if we're wrong? If they continue through the winter? Stalin's eyes were cold. Then we'll reassess. But I don't believe it will come to that. The Americans are not the Red Army. They're not accustomed to hardship, to sacrifice, to sustained effort in the face of difficulty. They'll try for a few months, declare a moral victory, and find a way to leave Berlin that doesn't look like surrender. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Go, monitor the airlift closely, report any problems, any signs that it's failing, but don't interfere unless I give explicit orders. Is that clear? They filed out, leaving Stalin alone in his office. He sat in silence for a long time, smoking his pipe, thinking about Truman and Churchill and the Americans who were now flying supplies into Berlin. He remembered a conversation with Churchill at Yalta in February 1945. They had been discussing the post-war division of Germany, and Churchill had made some comment about Western values, about democracy and freedom. "You British and Americans," Stalin had said, "you think you have a monopoly on virtue. You think your system is superior, your values are universal, but you're wrong, you're weak, you're soft. You won the war because we bled for you, because 27 million Soviets died while you sat safely behind your oceans." Churchill had looked at him with those cold blue eyes. "We may be soft, Marshal Stalin, but we're also stubborn, and when we commit to something, we see it through. Don't mistake patience for weakness." Now, sitting in his office in the Kremlin, Stalin wondered if Churchill had been right. Were the Americans stubborn enough to sustain an airlift for months? Were they willing to spend millions of dollars and risk their pilots' lives for a city that was, strategically speaking, indefensible? He didn't know. And that uncertainty bothered him more than he would ever admit. Over the following weeks, Stalin received daily reports on the airlift. At first, the numbers were modest, 100 flights per day, maybe 500 tons of supplies, not nearly enough to sustain Berlin. Soviet analysts predicted the operation would collapse within a month. But then the numbers started climbing. 200 flights per day, 300, 500. The Americans and British were improving their efficiency, establishing air traffic control systems, coordinating their operations. Pilots were flying multiple sorties per day. Ground crews were unloading planes in minutes. By August, the airlift was delivering 2,000 tons per day. Still not enough to fully sustain Berlin, but enough to keep the city alive, and the numbers kept climbing. Stalin read each report with growing frustration. The Americans were not giving up. They were doubling down, committing more resources, more aircraft, more personnel. And worst of all, they were succeeding. In September, Sokolovsky reported that the airlift had delivered 4,000 tons in a single day. Stalin read the report 3 times, then threw it across his desk. 4,000 tons, he said to Molotov, who was present for the briefing. In one day, that's what we said was impossible. Molotov looked uncomfortable. It's still not sustainable, Comrade Stalin. The weather will turn soon. Winter will make flying much more difficult. Will it? Stalin asked. Or will the Americans just fly in bad weather? Will they just accept the casualties and keep going? Because that's what we would do. That's what the Red Army did at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Berlin. We accepted the casualties and kept going. He stood and walked to the window. I underestimated them. I thought they were soft, that they wouldn't make sacrifices for a distant city. I was wrong. It's not too late to lift the blockade, Molotov ventured carefully. We could claim that technical issues have been resolved, that we're reopening the routes for humanitarian reasons. Stalin turned on him, his eyes blazing. And look weak, and admit that the Americans forced us to back down. Never. We maintain the blockade. If they want to waste their money flying supplies into Berlin, let them. Eventually they'll tire of it. But even as he said it, Stalin knew the situation was slipping away from him. The blockade had not forced the Western powers to negotiate. Instead, it had united them, had given them a cause they could rally around. And the airlift had become a symbol of Western resolve, a demonstration that free peoples could stand together against Soviet pressure. Worse, the people of Berlin were watching. The Germans who had fought for Hitler, who had invaded the Soviet Union, who had killed millions of Soviets, were now being saved by American and British pilots. Every plane that landed in Berlin was a propaganda victory for the West, a demonstration that the Americans kept their promises while the Soviets tried to starve civilians into submission. In October, Stalin called another meeting. This time he wanted hard numbers, realistic assessments. "Can they sustain this through winter?" he asked Sokolovsky. The Marshal consulted his notes. "Our analysts now believe they can, Comrade Stalin. They've improved their operations significantly. They have more aircraft, better coordination, more experienced crews, and they're building up stockpiles of coal and food in Berlin in preparation for winter." "What about accidents? Crashes?" "There have been some. About a dozen aircraft lost, 30 or so crew members killed. But the Americans accept these losses and continue. They treat their dead as heroes, as martyrs for freedom. It strengthens their resolve rather than weakening it." Stalin was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding for months. "If we maintain the blockade through winter and they continue the airlift, what happens?" Molotov answered, "We lose, Comrade Stalin. We lose credibility. We lose the propaganda war, and we demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union can be defied, that our blockades can be circumvented, that we're not as powerful as we claim. And if we lift the blockade now, we also lose, but perhaps less badly. We can claim that we've made our point, that we've demonstrated our concerns about West Germany. We can lift the blockade as a gesture of goodwill, as a way to reduce tensions." Stalin stood and walked to the map of Europe. His finger traced the air corridors into Berlin, the routes where American and British planes were flying day and night, bringing supplies to a city he had tried to starve into submission. "Truman has won," he said quietly. "I didn't think he had it in him. I thought he was a small man, a provincial politician who stumbled into the presidency. But he's proven me wrong. He committed to this airlift, and he's seeing it through. And now I have to decide whether to admit defeat or to keep the blockade in place and look increasingly foolish." He turned back to his advisors. "We continue the blockade through winter, but we prepare for the possibility of lifting it in the spring. We'll claim that we've achieved our objectives, that we've demonstrated our resolve. And then we'll find other ways to pressure the West, other places to push. Because this is a long struggle, and Berlin is just one battle." "And the airlift?" Beria asked. "The airlift continues," Stalin said bitterly. "And every plane that lands in Berlin is a reminder that we failed. That we tried to starve a city into submission, and the West refused to let it happen. It's a propaganda disaster. But there's nothing we can do about it now except minimize the damage." Through the winter of 1948 to 1949, the airlift continued. Planes flew in snow and fog and ice. Pilots died in crashes. But the supplies kept coming, and the people of Berlin, who had been enemies just 3 years earlier, watched in amazement as their former adversaries moved heaven and earth to keep them alive. In the Kremlin, Stalin watched with cold fury. He had miscalculated. He had pushed, and the West had pushed back harder. He had tried to demonstrate Soviet power, and instead he had demonstrated Soviet limitations. On May 12, 1949, after 318 days, Stalin lifted the blockade. He never admitted defeat, never acknowledged that the airlift had succeeded. The official Soviet statement claimed that the blockade had achieved its purpose, that technical issues had been resolved, that the Soviet Union was acting in the interest of peace. But everyone knew the truth. Stalin had tried to force the West out of Berlin, and he had failed. Truman had stood firm, the airlift had succeeded, and the Soviet Union had been forced to back down. When Molotov brought Stalin the draft order lifting the blockade, the dictator signed it without comment. Then he sat in silence for a long time, smoking his pipe, staring at nothing. Finally, he spoke. "What did I say when the Americans started dropping supplies into Berlin?" Molotov looked confused. "I don't understand, Comrade Stalin." What did I say? Stalin repeated. When the first reports came in about the airlift, what did I say? Molotov thought back to that night in June. You said it was impossible. You said they couldn't sustain it. Stalin nodded slowly. I said it was impossible. And I was wrong. That's what I said when the Americans started dropping supplies into Berlin. I said it was impossible. And that mistake cost us dearly. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over Moscow. I've been fighting for 40 years, against the whites, against the kulaks, against Hitler, against my own people when necessary, and I've won every fight. But this one I lost. Not because the Americans were stronger, but because I underestimated their resolve. He turned back to Molotov. Remember this lesson. The Americans are not as soft as they appear. When they commit to something, when they believe it's right, they can be as stubborn and as determined as we are. Maybe more so because they believe they're fighting for something larger than themselves. What are they fighting for? Molotov asked. Stalin was silent for a long moment. Then he said, They call it freedom. We call it imperialism. But whatever you call it, they're willing to sacrifice for it. And that makes them dangerous. What Stalin said when American planes started dropping supplies into Berlin evolved over the course of the blockade, from initial dismissal to grudging respect to bitter acknowledgement of defeat. In June 1948, when the airlift began, it's impossible, they can't sustain it, it's a propaganda stunt. In August 1948, as the airlift grew, they're wasting their money, winter will stop them. In December 1948, as the airlift continued through winter, they're more stubborn than I expected, but they'll eventually tire of it. In March 1949, as the airlift showed no signs of stopping, Truman has won. We need to find a way to lift the blockade without looking weak. And in May 1949, when the blockade was finally lifted, I underestimated them. I said it was impossible, and I was wrong. The Berlin Airlift was a turning point in the Cold War. It demonstrated that the West would stand firm against Soviet pressure. It transformed the people of Berlin from defeated enemies to valued allies. It established the principle that America would keep its commitments, and it showed Stalin that his strategy of expansion through intimidation had limits. For Stalin, it was a rare and bitter defeat. He had tried to force the West out of Berlin, and instead he had strengthened Western resolve. He had tried to demonstrate Soviet power, and instead he had demonstrated Soviet limitations. And he had learned that the Americans, when committed to a cause, could be as determined and as stubborn as the Red Army. It was a lesson he never forgot, and it shaped Soviet strategy for the remainder of the Cold War, making Stalin and his successors more cautious about direct confrontations with the West, more careful about pushing too far. In the end, what Stalin said when American planes started dropping supplies into Berlin was a reluctant admission that he had met his match. That Truman, the provincial politician he had dismissed, had outmaneuvered him, that the Americans, whom he had thought were soft, had proven to be anything but. It was, perhaps, the most honest assessment Stalin ever made of his Cold War adversaries, and it came at a cost he could barely afford to pay.